Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Amanda Silver. Amanda is CVP of Product for Developer Tools at Microsoft. Her team delivers the Visual Studio Platform and Visual Studio Code. Welcome, Amanda.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Amanda, before we get into the meat of things, would you give our listeners maybe a little bit of an introduction to yourself? Tell them how you got started in the industry?
Sure. I got started in the industry in 2001. Actually, I started at Microsoft right at the era when .NET was first coming out. I wasn't here for the inception of .NET. I think I arrived right after the first launch of .NET. And my first features that I worked on as a PM in the team was COM interrupt. Before that, I had, I think, a couple of technical internships as a college undergrad. One was converting a signal processing library to the C++ standard template library. And I was a Unix sysadmin in college. So, that gave me a lot of good background. But over the last, I guess it's now 20 years, I've just worked on developer tools and platforms at Microsoft. And so I've kind of worked on everything from, Windows and SQL and everything that everybody thinks about as Microsoft platforms, always from the developer perspective. I've worked on Xbox, a little bit on Quantum, basically anything that has to do with any of our platforms, I've touched in some way, but always from the developer perspective.
Okay, so what I guess that has really led to what you're still working on these days, and what is that? What is your role in that developer tools these days?
So today we have a pretty, good sized team that works on all of our compilers, programming languages, application runtimes, tools and IDEs, the developer experience for Azure, all of those things is part of my team. And so, anything that basically, if you're a developer or you're doing some kind of automation for a platform at Microsoft, that's what my team builds. So TypeScript, Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, .NET, all of those things.
Awesome. Well, I'm a huge fan of Visual Studio Code, by the way, and that's pretty much what I daily drive. So thanks for that.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, my daily driver is still Visual Studio, full version. But I've been transitioning to Visual Studio Code more for JavaScript development these days. I was using WebStorm for a number of years and really and have enjoyed making that transition.
Yeah, I think, Visual Studio is still definitely the best experience that we have for .NET developers and C# and, huge number of C++ developers, especially in AAA gaming, use and prefer Visual Studio because of the strength and the power and all of the configurability that you have there. And then client development is also really great in Visual Studio. But for JavaScript developers, for, Python developers, VS Code is probably, what's going to be the best experience for them.
Yeah, between those two, you've hands down have the best IDEs and editors for programming, period.
It's all about listening to developers and, what their pain points are and addressing them.
Sweet.
So with that, we before before hitting record, we were talking about next generation and mentoring and helping those get into the industry and what we can do. What are the things that we can do more of to help inspire the next generation of developers or help people get into the industry, help them feel comfortable and welcomed and productive?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, everything that I do, that I work on, is all about the fact that we have a massive developer shortage right now. We think that there's going to be 150 million tech or tech adjacent jobs in the next 5 years in terms of demand. And we have, fewer than 10 million pro developers in the United States.
Wow.
And so the demand is just absolutely enormous. And of course, that's why, it's a great, generation to be a developer. It's very exciting, and you can work on all this amazing technology. And certainly as, the economy is going through this situation with the pandemic recovery and the economic impact that's happening with that, there's going to be a lot of people who are looking to transition into higher paying jobs, transition into higher skilled jobs, and acquire all of those skills as part of that. And probably the next generation also is seeing this as an incredible opportunity to get into it as well. So, there's so many things that we can do to actually bring more people into the industry. I think about this as like minting new developers. That's basically how we have to think about it. And it's not just like, can we actually bring them with their skill sets and prepare them with the right sets of skills, but also can we actually make this next generation of the tech workforce more diverse, so that we actually have more diverse voices creating technology that really is intended to serve everyone. So there's a lot of different things that we can do. We've studied deeply many of the problems that relate to different dimensions of the various pipeline problems that we have in the tech industry. Everything from, the curriculum, what do you actually need to know and understand to be successful in tech, to, how do we actually support people with diverse backgrounds? How do we support people who have non-traditional backgrounds to transfer into the tech industry and become developers? So these are all these different things that we think about. One really important discovery that we learned about over the past year, 2 years now, is first of all, there's just an absolute shortage of educators in terms of CS professors, TAs, people who can actually teach coding to one another. And part of the reason for that is that there's such incredible demand from the industry for everyone to move into an industry job. So we just don't have great educators that are out there that are supporting people who are interested in learning how to code. And there's such huge demand, waiting lists at every university, every community college to actually get into a class that can teach them how to code. So that's thing one, is just, we need to actually get the industry to be more involved in actually bringing in the next generation of developers and helping people transition their skill sets. The other thing that we're seeing is that a lot of people, especially those who don't necessarily have traditional backgrounds, or like me, I had a dad who was helping me, get into STEM since I was 3 years old. I was very lucky, but there are a lot of people who don't have that kind of background and don't have that kind of support throughout their career. And one of the things that we've recognized that we need to help them with is this aspect of grit and resilience in tech that is so important for you to be successful. When I think about like even just debugging,
Yes.
right? Like hundreds of times a day, probably thousands of times a day, you actually go through this cycle of failure.
Oh yeah.
Where you recognize there's something that's actually a bug in your application, and how do I, resolve this and figure out how to make this right. And that also happens on day one when you actually need to set up your dev box. That's such a painful experience, and you almost always need to ask for help to actually get that to work from a human.
Right.
And so there's an aspect of resilience, self-efficacy, self-determination, the notion that I can actually do this and I have confidence that I can figure this out. All of those things we believe are skills that actually people can be taught and should be taught. And it's almost like an alternative, tech curriculum that we've been trying to support. So we've released a couple of videos and a mentoring program that actually will help with all of this, which we can provide links to.
I'd like to see that, because I spend the majority of my day programming, wondering what it is that I'm doing, and just knowing that if I keep at it, I will force the compiler to do what I want it to do instead of what it wants me to do. And so I just keep banging my head into the wall until it works. And for someone coming in new, like I've picked up extra languages or extra frameworks, and it's always this daunting, I don't know what I'm doing feeling. So for someone brand new who's never done anything coming in, I can't even imagine how thick that wall of that they have to bang their head through to get going. So what do you have any quick tips for someone who's trying to help someone new to pick that up? Just keep getting at it, and you'll get it eventually. I know it's not easy, but you got to keep going, because
Yeah.
sometimes I say that to somebody, and maybe it works at first, but after 6 hours of it not working, they're usually done, right?
Yeah. So we worked with Mount Holyoke, which is a college that has actually a fantastic computer science department that has amazing retention rates in terms of keeping people interested in the field. We worked with them to develop a curriculum to help with these skill sets. And we produced 10 videos that are like 2 minutes long. They're super easy, that go through these different kinds of skills like tech resilience, self-efficacy, growth mindset, a lot of these grit aspects. And that's been published. We published it on Microsoft and Culture. And what we found is that actually sharing these concepts, not just with the students who are struggling through this, but actually with the people who are mentoring them, is just as important. Because, when you think about, I remember when I was in the 8th grade, my sister, maybe I was in the 10th grade and my sister was in the 8th grade or something like that. And she was going through learning algebra. And algebra came super easy to me. And it was really a struggle for her. And I remember going through this moment that I was just convinced that there was no way that she was ever going to learn algebra. It was just not physically possible. Like there was some, intrinsic difference between her and me that made it so that I could learn algebra and she could not learn algebra. And, if you watch these videos and you kind of get this idea of growth mindset, then you just, it's not how you think about it. There is no intrinsic difference that anyone, has that prevents them from understanding a concept like that. It's just a matter of, figuring out what is the right way to teach that particular person how to learn that skill. And so I think when mentors come into a relationship with a mentee with that in mind, it's not bringing the mentee through how I learned how to code. It's how you need to learn to code. And so that also becomes almost a puzzle in itself, right? When you're interacting with somebody, how can you understand what they're going through, what their mental model is of what they think they understand, and how can you bring them through the next level of understanding?
Yeah, and in this era where we're all now working from home and everybody is feeling a little bit of isolation, I'm really enjoying being on Teams calls and or watching Twitch live coders and at least feeling some connection with humans, especially the live coders. Some I really enjoy that will celebrate their failures, and you can see the mental model. You can see them working a problem. You can see them hitting a brick wall, feeling like they don't know what they're doing, just like me. And oh yeah, I missed a semicolon, and now it works. And now I'm a golden god.
This is such a generational shift, actually, in terms of how people are learning tech. Right? It's huge, because in my era, it was the RTFM era. I think those who've been in the industry for a long time know what that stands for, but it's read the F manual, or the man page, depending on which where you were coming from. But it was kind of this idea that you needed to do self-help to the nth degree before you were allowed to ask anybody a question. Yep. And that was kind of the mentality of the generation that I got brought up in. For this new generation, everything is social, everything is collaborative. And they're not learning from man pages or documentation. They're learning from videos. They're learning from Twitch. They're learning from TikTok. Like, they're learning from these bite-sized multimedia experiences, but they're still learning tech and they're still learning how to code. So, super fascinating.
That kind of makes me wonder. So, okay, so like Stack Overflow. I don't think anyone would say it's not a wonderful thing, right? But you were talking about grit earlier, and having something so fantastic as Stack Overflow, or even the modifications that have been made to the Microsoft Docs, in recent years. I mean, I remember having to load up CD3 of the MSDN library, hitting F1, and then searching for the thing that you wanted. So like,
And even search didn't even work that well.
yeah, you had to type it exactly right. But like now with Stack Overflow and some of these other services, there's less determination necessary. You can ask a question and get an answer sometimes, like pretty quick. So I wonder if, I don't want Stack Overflow to go anywhere, but is it possible that it's almost damaging to new developers because they don't get that determination? They didn't have to work 6 hours to write "Hello World" to the screen.
I mean, that's also the same debate that often happens around, should everybody learn to be able to write their own file system?
Oh, yeah.
Should everybody
Absolutely.
be able to learn to write their own kernel?
Everyone should know assembly. Why doesn't everybody know
Well,
assembly?
Here's the thing, right? If we have 150 million jobs in the next 5 years, sorry, hold on one second. Somebody was calling me. Need to figure out how to turn that off. Sorry. If we have 150 million jobs in demand over the next 5 years, not everybody is going to be able to write a virtual file system to be able to enter the tech industry. And so I think we really do need to think about, what is almost like there is a culture of gatekeeping a little bit that happens in the industry for sure. And in various communities, Stack Overflow has their own norms in terms of, what's a, good question, what's not a good question. And so, I think there is a certain amount that we have to help people understand how much they can help themselves before they ask for help from other people. But at the same time, the levels of abstraction that we need people to be able to work with today are very different than the levels of abstraction that we needed to work with 20 years ago. And so I think, I think one of the things that's really interesting is this next generation of people in the tech industry are going to have different skill sets because, if you even think about the fact that search has changed so much over the past 10 years in terms of how I code, right? It's not that I have an IDE and I'm doing all my development on my box. I have an IDE in a browser because I'm constantly switching between, the code that I'm writing and the documentation or a search or some kind of thing. This is constant. So, I think the idea that you need to memorize all of the different algorithms, the binary search trees, how to sort them and things like that. That's just not what this generation would actually do because you now can go and search for what that algorithm should be. You still need to understand basics of computational complexity and things like that to understand how efficient your algorithms are going to be. But the idea that everybody needs to memorize this tome of all of the various different merge sorts or the merge sort algorithm and the bubble sort or whatever it is, it's just a different it's a different generation when you can actually at the touch of your fingers get an answer to any question that you might have around algorithms or around APIs or anything like that, and you think differently.
Yeah,
So when are you guys going to bring that search and browser right into my IDE?
Well,
Then I don't have to switch.
Just hit
I think
F1,
that-
Ash.
I think we actually have been working. You don't need to be kidding because we have been working on it a lot in collaboration with the Bing team, improving our search experience in Visual Studio. And we don't necessarily want to replace the browser, but we do want to make it easier when you're in the context of the code that you're writing to be able to do searches that are contextual, that are informed by the code that you're actually writing at this moment.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, the whole IntelliSense, like having IntelliSense and then having, it's got a different name now, like a more fancy IntelliCode. Yeah.
Yeah.
Having IntelliCode is amazing. Like used to I couldn't program without F1, and now I just put my mouse over top of something, and it's there's all the information I need. Like that is game changing from a programmer's perspective, even if you're a new programmer, because you don't have to go and look up how to use that thing that you're trying to use. It just shows you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other dimension that we really think about, in addition to minting new developers, is developer velocity. So this idea of not just how can I make an individual developer more productive with every character that they write, make them more intelligent, make them write the correct character and fewer characters to be able to write the code that they need to write. But also as they work in a team, how can we make that team more efficient as well, so that they have fewer bugs that make it into production. They have less, remediation that they need to do. They have style. One of the things that's really fascinating, depending on the study, there are a couple different studies, but somewhere between 25% and 65% of commit comments, like code review comments, are stylistic, not behavioral. Right? And so if we could actually help new developers who are new to a team, whether they're a junior developer coming out of college or they're just an industry developer coming into your code base, learn what are the style norms for that code base as they're writing code for the first time, so that you can reduce that amount, all of those comments that you'd have to go through and react to. That would be pretty incredible, and that saves a lot of time. So that's a good example of the kinds of things that we think we can do with IntelliCode, with machine learning being applied to analyzing code bases and helping developers as they write code.
Yeah, a lot of the commit messages that I see are try one, try again, this didn't work.
Yep.
So anything that we can do to reduce that that feedback cycle of we tried something, it didn't work, try it again, auto formatting, auto completion, those things help me to be so much more productive.
Yeah, and the other thing with this too is also, like, developers are lifelong learners, right? We're constantly learning a new technology to write this new thing that we have to work on. And that's kind of one of the things that makes it a joy to be a developer. But the way that you typically learn APIs is generally not by learning new programming languages, but actually by learning APIs, right? You learn a new domain through the API. And APIs really often come with like idiomatic calling patterns, like what is the typical way that you do error handling for this API? Or what is, I have to create this factory before I can, construct it, or I have to pass in this auth token or whatever it is. But there's like this order that you have to go in. And so that's another great example where we can actually take things like AI models and actually inform the developer as they're writing that code.
And you had mentioned, with the need for more developers and getting developers where we can, minting the new developers from where they are, where they exist, whether that's fresh off the street, whether that's out of college, out of a code school or a code camp. I enjoy working with newer developers and figuring out what their knowledge base is. And okay, we're implementing this feature. What can you tell me that you've learned in this scenario so far? Is there something that we could or should do to get that understanding a little bit earlier and maybe help get that common vocabulary together earlier?
It's a great question. Just kind of, you're trying to understand like where that new developer is coming from in terms of their background. I mean, how often when you have a new member on the team, do you actually talk about what their experience is? I'm not sure that I've ever had that conversation with, you have it in the interview, but you don't have it when you're bringing this new person into the code base. It's like you give them the map. You know what I mean? But you don't actually talk about, like, have you ever driven stick shift?
Yeah.
Right? And maybe that's part of what we need to start when we think about, a lot of times we talk about the notion of like tribal knowledge, that there's, for a given team, there is this knowledge base that basically everybody in the team has amassed. And part of the challenge in being a newbie on the team is you need to extract that tribal knowledge. How can we actually share that tribal knowledge with people, or create, like self-documenting code or other things like that, so that people understand how they can come on board. I think there's an aspect of the skill set that's really interesting, where we don't really talk about what that individual developer is bringing to the equation, and I think that's a really good point.
So, excuse me. One of the things that my background is really a sort of self-taught, or I love community-taught individual. And one of the things that really was a huge challenge for me to get into any of the Microsoft tooling was the lack of documentation and the closed sourceness of it when I was getting into it. So I started going after PHP and other things that had a lot better documentation, Linux, and so on and so forth. But that's not the case with Microsoft these days. And I'm super inspired by what Microsoft has done in the open source area, and what they've done with their basically making the tooling open and available. And what's Microsoft's vision for sort of bringing that even more, and even branching into some of the areas like low code or no code?
Yeah, so to me, this is all about like, how do we help developers and their teams scale better? And how do we help the industry scale better, given the demand that we're seeing right now? Huge demand, and especially during this pandemic period, there's been even more demand for digital solutions. It's like everybody has moved to, telehealth and curbside pickup and all of these things that require new digital solutions to be created to actually facilitate. There's just this huge swath of all these new customer solutions that have come out in the last year. So I think open source is definitely a really important way that development teams can scale, right? Certainly there's an aspect from the platform perspective when it comes to .NET, or if it comes to Visual Studio Code, where, there's an advantage to us to make it open source, because, a lot of enterprises trust it more when they can see the code base. It's easier to extend. And obviously, if we're in the business of being a platform, then we want to make sure that it's extensible. But when it comes to enterprise software, the thing that's really true, and it's true for our own code as well, because we use open source extensively inside of Microsoft as well, including open source that Microsoft didn't author, is that it allows you to build on the shoulders of giants, right? There's so many solutions that are out there, whether it's, just connecting via a real-time socket. It's a good example. There are probably 50 to 100 different libraries out there that allow you to use WebSockets for a video conferencing, as an example, right? To build that kind of an application. And so, there are advantages to having, your own version of that for performance reasons, for the scale that you might need. But if you're building something quick for, then you can definitely use a lot of the solutions that are out there. The thing that is the most important is that you are focused on the code that only you can write. That's really what I want to focus on, is like, how can I make sure that you only need to write the code that only you can write for your organization, and everything else you can actually use from the community. And this is also an incredible way to learn too. You can look at other people's code and learn how to use various APIs, or how to, construct things, how to organize things, different kinds of calling patterns, coding conventions. There's so much that you can learn from the community as well. So to me, a lot of open source is really about how do we help teams scale. And the thing that's kind of interesting about it is there's so many advantages to it in terms of the community, in terms of, being able to hire talent that's out there in the community and find the talent that's out there in the community, being able to, put all of these different pieces together almost like Legos. But there's also a little bit of, there's a little bit of concern about it as well, because, when you start to use open source, then you are basically inviting everyone into your supply chain, right?
Yeah.
And so another big, huge focus for us has been on securing that supply chain. How can we make sure that the open source that you take a dependency on, you can have confidence that the person that you wrote it was the person that you were expecting to write it, that the security vulnerabilities that have already been identified have been addressed. And so there's a lot of stuff that we're doing in GitHub with GitHub Advanced Security, for example, that will help you find those kinds of things. Dependapot is an example of something that can help you discover all of the dependencies that your library has. We've been working on improving the security of NuGet package authoring and consumption as an example. So this is just this huge challenge that we have over the next few years. But really, this is all about helping developers and the finite, number of people we have in the industry scale as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah, the first time Dependabot submitted a PR to one of my personal projects, I'm like, what is this magic? It solved a problem for me that I didn't even know I had, fixed it, and submitted a PR. Like, yes, merge that, please.
It's pretty amazing.
And it seems like that is such a departure from the Microsoft of the Ballmer years, where people were spelling Microsoft with the $, and it was a big evil corporation, and it's just so not that anymore. I was working with a guy a couple of years ago when the GitHub acquisition was announced. He was just furious because he had that old mental model of Microsoft, but just the continued advancement of the things that are being done at GitHub, it just shows the commitment that Microsoft has to open source.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a huge... Hold on one second. The sun is in my eyes. I just need to close this blind.
Problem.
Apologies. Hold on. There, much better. Yeah, I mean, that has certainly been a huge change that I've seen personally from where I sit over the past, decade now. I'm looking at the date. I'm looking at the date because the first time that Microsoft really started to use open source and to actually redistribute open source was with jQuery with ASP.NET, about a decade ago. And about that same time, I started to work with Anders and a bunch of other colleagues on the early version of TypeScript. And that's a good example where we actually originally wrote it to be used by the Office team, who is transitioning, the client software of Office, which is originally a C++ code base, over into Office 365, which was going to be hosted by the browser. And, the Office team had a question for us around, like, what's the best way to deal with this amount of JavaScript? And we didn't really have a great answer at the time.
No.
And after we looked at the problem for a little while, we kind of realized, well, okay, so if we build something for them, we have to make sure that it's not something unique to Microsoft developers, because like internal Microsoft developers, because if we do that, then we're basically not going to benefit from the way that the ecosystem is evolving, right? We're going to be on our own little island. And so what we wanted to do is to actually build something that, the general, all developers use, and that kind of docked well with the general web ecosystem. And at the time, web developers were fairly hostile towards Microsoft. I think there was some hangover of IE6 in those days.
Just a
and
little
so, so the idea that we could, release something to JavaScript developers that they would receive well and be friendly towards was daunting. And so, when we first started working on TypeScript, we were pretty intimidated in a lot of ways around whether or not we thought that the JavaScript community would like it and use it. Our hope was certainly that they would, but we just needed to make sure that it wasn't its own little island of tooling, so that our Office team would end up in their own island and not be able to benefit from the rest of the web community and what web developers were developing for their development practices. And so I think, obviously the last 10 years have been pretty amazing. It's a little less than 10 years, it's about 9 years. Pretty amazing for TypeScript's growth, but it's certainly a big difference between, what it took to get TypeScript to be open source in those days versus what it would take to release something open source these days at Microsoft, right? Took me about at least a summer to get approval to get TypeScript to be open source. But now, the default, especially for developer frameworks and programming languages and things like that, is open source for sure.
It really is a big change in just the way Microsoft operates. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So earlier you had mentioned this massive influx of developers over the next 5 years, and I guess it's just a matter of math, right? They double every so many years, and everything is tech now. There isn't a single thing that doesn't have a computer in it, so somebody's got to write the code. And Microsoft, obviously, you mentioned earlier, is trying to figure out ways to train those new developers, or at least help them get trained. But is there anything else that Microsoft is working on that will help with the influx, new tools, or more extensive training, or just anything, I guess?
Yeah, well, there's a ton. I mean, obviously, we continue to work on LinkedIn Skills and Microsoft Learn, which is this new website that basically can bring people through different skill sets incrementally, so they can learn different kinds of technologies. We are investing in, the Global Skills Initiative, which will bring all of these different skills to over 25 million people. So that's what we're trying to work on with free learning content and certifications and all of that kind of stuff. So yes, definitely, there's a tremendous amount of content that's out there. The other stuff that we're trying to do is all of this stuff around kind of the developer velocity aspects of it. When you come to a new code base, how quickly can you learn that code base? And how can we have tools to actually help you learn that code base? I mentioned at the beginning of this how challenging it is to actually set up a developer environment. And one of the things that I think is exciting about the next couple of years is as we introduce GitHub Codespaces, which basically is a way for you to describe a developer environment in a repeatable way that can then be instanced as a VM or a container in the cloud. That makes it so that if you set up a developer environment for your project, the next person on your team doesn't have to go through the rigmarole of having to set up that dev box. If you think about any boot camp, right? Usually a boot camp cannot be less than a day, because at least the first half of that day is just doing the dev box setup.
Yep.
And so this will take that from, setting up a Python environment, for example, which is probably one of the hardest stacks to be able to stand up properly because of all of the different versions that you need and things. That can go from, an error-prone half day to a couple of minutes of running a script.
Yeah, that made me think of the remote containers that VS Code supports.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that feature, and I can't wait till the parody of that feature is in Visual Studio proper. I want to get that in my C# projects, but I'm still using Visual Studio for that. That feature is a complete game changer because, like you said, you set up your entire dev environment, and not only your dev environment as far as the language libraries installed and helper libraries, but also the database that's going to pretend to be the production database, and Redis and whatever else, and none of it has to be like on your machine. I saw a tweet that you did. I don't know when it was, but sometime in the past, and you were kind of doing a pun on somebody keeping their system from getting rusty or something like that, because they had built
That
up.
was yesterday.
Okay, yeah. I guess it was in Twitter, and I didn't scroll down too far, so it couldn't have been too long ago. But they had built up an entire Rust environment, like in a container or VM. I'm not sure which one, but just to be able to do that, and then, like you said, check it into source control, and then the next person that comes along is you need Git and you need this IDE, and then you're good. Like, that is amazing, because it turns that half day into, like you said, like just a couple minutes.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. And it's also super helpful. I think the default for developers, there's this pets versus cattle debate, right? For your dev box, you think about your main machine as your pet, right? It requires care and feeding and love and all of these kinds of things. And so, so that idea, I think, can go away. Like, you have to set up a dev box. I was talking to senior management at some point, and I was explaining how often you have to set up a dev box as a developer. And people who are not in the industry just don't get it. They don't understand how frequent this is. But you actually have to do it like sometimes multiple times a week, because you have to set up the dev environment for your main project that you're working on. Now you're being asked to go look at some new technology. So you need to set up another dev environment to go look at that new technology. And then there's some other bug that comes in that you have to respond to. And that's, based on an SDK that shipped 6 months ago. And so then you need to set up yet another dev box, right? So it's just this really frequent activity. And if we can reduce that down from hours to, just a couple of minutes or even less, I think that's a perfect example of how we can improve developer velocity.
Awesome. So we've talked about a lot of things. Are there any resources that you might point people to who are trying to get started with different things? They're looking for a mentor. They're trying to get started in development. Pretty much anything that we've talked about.
Yeah, there's so many different things that I could point you to. First of all, I think the series on tech resilience is definitely a must-watch, not just for people who are trying to get into tech as students, but those who mentor them, even those who are mentoring people who are new on your team. We found it useful even for our own team in terms of creating the culture of the growth mindset and kind of this always be learning organization. So we've used it internally. So that I would definitely point to is the InCulture website that we've talked about. I think the skills initiative and all of the things that we've done there around all of the LinkedIn Learning, the free certificates, the learning labs, and GitHub, all of those things are basically free resources that we've been working on to help usher in this new generation of developers, really. So I definitely look at all of those things. Another couple of really fun things, like I said earlier, my dad was a huge influence on me getting into the tech industry, and he wasn't in tech, he was a physicist, but he was in STEM. And so I think, for those, I know there's a lot of people in tech who are parents and, want to encourage their kids to get interested in STEM fields. And so some of the other really fun stuff that we've done is we've created labs for kids and students who are in higher education in partnership with Netflix to be based on that movie Over the Moon. So that's a good example. That's targeted at more kind of the younger generation of kids who aren't yet in high school or college. And then there's also something that we've been working with LeBron James on with Space Jam that we recently released, which are just basically like little puzzles, coding puzzles, so that kids can learn how to code using our technology, of course, but it's something that's really fun to do with your kids. And then I also recently did a couple of labs with my kid, who's 7, with Wonder Woman. We've been working on the Wonder Woman 1984 with something called MakeCode, which is something we've been working on, which is specifically a coding environment, all web hosted, that allows kids to start to learn to code using blocks. And then they can get into TypeScript or Python actual coding in an actual coding editor once they become a little bit proficient. But it's kind of like a really easy way to create gaming environments, for example, or to actually interact with IoT. So definitely a lot of fun different things to look at.
Those are super cool. Sounds awesome.
Cool.
Has there been anything helpful in your career that you might share with those just getting started or those maybe looking to level up their own careers? Words
That's
of wisdom.
Good question. I think, a lot of times I get asked the question from college hires who were like myself 20 years ago. What would you say to someone who's coming into the industry at that point in their lives? And there's a couple of things that I always say. Number one is use the fact that you're the new person as long as you possibly can. There's 2 reasons why that's super important. One is it allows you to ask questions that other people have not asked in a while. Right? It doesn't mean they haven't asked them, but they haven't asked them in a while. And bringing that beginner's mind to anything is always incredibly useful to everyone. So, use that. The other thing is, when I came into the industry, there was kind of this idea that like taking notes at meetings was a secretary's job. There was kind of like a gendered aspect to it, right? And what I found was that by taking notes, it actually was a position of power because it allowed me to force everybody in the meeting to explain the concepts to me so that I could take great notes. If I was going to send them out, that I was basically the person who was keeping the record of what was discussed and what was concluded on. And I also controlled like the next step of action items and things like that. And so I found that to be a really incredible way to get my foothold in the first few years. And so that's the other thing I would say.
That's an interesting social work hack. I hadn't heard that one before. I like that one.
Yeah.
So where can our listeners go to follow you and keep up with whatever it is you're working on?
Well, I'm definitely on Twitter every once in a while, Amanda K. Silver. I'm on LinkedIn every once in a while. I think I'm also Amanda K. Silver there too. Let me check. Yes, Amanda K. Silver. But, if you just keep looking at the Visual Studio blog, the Visual Studio Code blog, always look at, learn.microsoft.com to see what's the new stuff coming out there. And the aka.ms /skills also has all of our new content for reskilling and upskilling and acquiring new skills.
Excellent. All right. Well, chat, hang out just a few minutes. We'll wrap up from here. Amanda was kind enough to say that she would stick around for a few minutes. We don't want to take up too much of her time. I'm sure she has a hard stop and more important work to get to, but we'll continue the conversation for just a minute afterwards. So with that, we'll say, Amanda, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That was Amanda Silver. Amanda is CVP of product for developer tools at Microsoft. Her team delivers the Visual Studio Platform and Visual Studio Code.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
Catch us live each week on Twitch, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
And the recording has stopped. Okay, completely random. We're the podcast is over now. Now we're just having fun talking. Completely random. But what is your camera setup? Because it seriously looks like you're looking right at me.
Oh, really?
And I can't like
That's
I can
good.
look at the camera, but it feels real weird. But is it just a laptop with a camera or something else?
No, no, no. What I have is I have a standing desk, and then I have a monitor, and then I have a webcam that I put on the monitor right there. So
Okay.
yeah,
It really looks like you're looking at the camera, which
that's
is,
good.
normally
good.
people look, like I'm looking at John, so I'm looking like way off to the side.
Yeah, no, very good. I loved the two pieces of advice you gave. The first one is one of my favorite. I always sort of word it like a lot of times people feel like they're inexperienced, right? And what they don't realize is that they're inexperienced. You should turn that around. It's one of your biggest assets that you have when you're getting
Exactly.
started, because that's where innovation happens. Innovation always comes out of inexperience, because otherwise it's not innovation, right? So it's your job to come and take that inexperience and liven up everything. And you
Yeah.
either learn or you change things, and that's really the power of that. So yeah, I really love that.
Yeah, totally agree.
That's
You're
kind of
almost
like,
like weaponizing your newbiness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
well, it's like Richard Feynman, I think, tells a story or told a story like when he was working on the Manhattan Project. He showed up day one and he was like, "What happens if that breaks?" Just pointed to a random spot on the blueprint,
Right.
and the other people in the room were like, "Oh no."
That's such a great example. Richard, it's funny you should mention him. Richard Feynman was actually my dad's professor. I mentioned
awesome.
he was a physicist. So yeah, yeah.
That would have been a really good class to attend. I've watched a few of his videos and stuff, and the way that he explains things, just awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
my parents were always very supportive of me learning and doing whatever. My mother worked for state government. My father was a Presbyterian minister, but my mother brought home an IBM Luggable one weekend to do some work at home, and I was like, "That's awesome! I want to do that." So that was
That's
kind
awesome.
of how I got the bug. And I know that there's there is certainly a need for developers. There's always a need for more developers, but I've been hearing for the last 20 years that AI is coming and we're going to automate all the jobs and we're not even going to need developers and stuff. I'm like, but and they're still saying that, but there's still so much of a need just for regular
Such a
everyday.
huge need. And like, what we've seen over decades is we just keep climbing the abstraction ladder and building, more holistic end-to-end solutions. So I think we have hundreds of years, 100 years before we don't have a developer need.
Yeah, I don't think it's coming anytime soon because I don't think that a computer could possibly figure out what the business is asking for.
Yeah, yeah. No, believe me, I'm definitely aware of the most cutting edge aspects of computer generated code. And while I think we're going to make some pretty amazing advancements in the next couple of years, like huge advancements, there's no way that it's anywhere close to taking anybody's job away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're continuing to do our part to show people that we've been doing this for a long time and we still struggle. We were live coding last night and struggling through very basic things.
Yeah.
Don't be picking on me.
The other thing too that's really funny about that conversation is that developers like automate everything. It's what we do because we know that it's repeatable, it's more reliable, it's you can debug it. But if you have human processes, those are the ones that can have more errors in them. And so to me, this is just an extension of further automation.
And we're incredibly lazy. I don't want to do the same thing twice.
Yeah, exactly. To me, it's all about removing the mundane and the tedious and the repetitive. All of that is really what we're trying to focus our AI efforts on.
Yeah, my lifelong goal is to sit around and do nothing. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, we also, I know we had talked about sort of that needing to learn, or especially the sort of the, you need to understand how the lower level things. And what I found, I feel like, and this is even since I've been in the industry, I've came in later than the rest of everyone here. But it's grown so much, and it continues to expand the kind of the breadth of knowledge. And what I found is teaching people to sort of like that black box where you have to say, I need to know what the outputs are and the inputs, and you learn that API level where it's like, I know how to operate what's going on down here, and then this domain that I'm working in is really the area of information that I really need to focus on, and the rest of it just you talked about that abstraction away. And I think that can be difficult. It was difficult for me to do that. I would always like, yeah, but why? How does that work? And it took a while for me to sort of sink in and go, okay, I don't need to know everything. I just need to know how to operate this, and we'll figure that out later. And it sort of came to me out of necessity, but I think if we can. I don't know how you approach that to people, but that's one of the things I think really helps sort of just in time learning or
Totally.
that like not feeling like overwhelmed because you don't know everything.
Yeah, I think, there are only probably a couple of thousand, maybe tens of thousands of developers in the world that do kernel level programming.
Yep.
And like systems level programming, right? And a vast majority of the developers in the world are writing line of business applications, web applications, mobile applications that are not concerned necessarily with the assembler level optimizations that you might need to do, or even have perf constraints for their applications that matter to that point.
Yes.
And so we just absolutely need to think about the scale and the fact that not every developer needs to be a kernel level systems programmer to be successful in the tech industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've been a line of business CRUD developer for 20 years.
Yeah. And it turns out, you can make a living off of that.
Doing all right. Yeah.
It is all I have done professionally as well, but I have written my own very simple operating system from assembly because I'm that person.
You're also trying to forge your own car motor.
Yes. You cast the car motor, but
Whatever.
I have a large stack of aluminum cans that I'm going to melt down and cast.
Wow.
And build a car.
So I have gotten to the point where I can accept that I don't need to know how X works right now, but I do have to know how it works eventually. I want to know all the things from as low a level as I possibly can.
Do you raise your own farm animals and
I couldn't kill anything.
slaughter? No.
No, I couldn't do that. That's the like I know. No, I can't do that. Butchering is the one thing I'll never learn. That and plumbing. I hate plumbing. But everything else, like if I could go to the stream and dig up some clay and then filter the iron out of it and make a bloomery and melt the iron down and then forge my own steel from the iron that I made from the riverbank, that I would totally do that. Because I don't know. I want to know how everything works. In general, I do want to know how the whole animal slaughtering thing works, but I don't want to see it and I don't want to do it. So I have a bit of a conundrum there.
And you do all that so that you can do nothing.
Well, so okay.
He's an enigma.
Yeah. So my lifelong goal is to sit around and do nothing, and by nothing I mean whatever it is that I'm encapsulated encaptivated with at the moment, which is generally the hardest thing that I can think of.
So did we miss anything? Is there what is next? What should we be looking forward to? Is there are there things that we should be doing as a community?
I think one angle of the way that we think about scaling that we didn't really get to talk about is low code and the kind of role that low code plays in this as well. Kind of going back to that idea that like not every developer needs to be a kernel developer, that a lot of developers are writing line of business applications, and that requires a different level of sophistication or systems level understanding. I think what we're finding is that we've now created a set of tools in a way that we can have abstractions that can make it so that people who are closer to the domain that they're creating the technology for can actually create those solutions, whether it's a mobile application or a web application, things like that. And to me, I view maybe some people in the developer industry are like, low code, that's not coding. How is that something that's interesting to developers? But to me, I view this as a way that development teams can scale, right? Because if we can actually empower domain experts to self-serve and to create a certain category of IT applications that otherwise would have gone into the central IT department to fill out a ticket for, then that's another way that I can basically reduce the burden on the finite amount of developer talent we have in the world.
Yeah. Well, and the way I look at it is a programmer or a developer is just the person telling the computer what to do. It doesn't matter how they're telling the computer what to do. Like if you are a wizard at using Microsoft Word, then you're a Word programmer in my mind.
I mean, how many people have created like absolutely amazing line of business applications out of Excel?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Huge.
And that's that. Like that is programming to me. It's just at a certain level of abstraction.
Right.
I'm sure that when higher order languages came out and assembly was the only thing at the moment, and then something else came out, people were like, "Oh no, that doesn't feel like programming." But I mean, the tools were going to evolve over time, and it's just a matter of the programmer is the person that's translating what the business is asking for into something that the computer understands, regardless of what that medium of translation is.
And that, I think, goes to the skills question too. Like, what are the skills that this next generation really need to understand? They still need to understand like requirements gathering and understanding who is the customer and what is the business problem that we're trying to solve, and relating that to the technology. That's will continue to be so important.
Yeah.
I unfortunately feel like a lot of this generation still needs to learn requirements gathering.
Yeah.
I was going to stay away from that can of worms. So, in your mind, low code, would that what is the name of it? Microsoft came out with Light Switch, Light.
Yeah, a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Now when it came out, it was supposed to be, for my understanding, I could be wrong, but it was supposed to be for more business type users to be able to access their data and put together some kind of thing that was valuable to them. And maybe it worked for them, but me personally, like as a developer, like with my head all in the code, I opened it up and I was lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think the spiritual successor to LightSwitch is Power Apps today, right? And one of the things that has happened between LightSwitch and Power Apps, LightSwitch originally was developed in Silverlight, and we all know what happened there.
Sadness.
But the thing that's kind of interesting is what has happened since is we've actually created more formalized definitions of like how to have components that can interact together and web APIs and things like that. And so Power Apps, I think, has been a phenomenal success for WYSIWYG, application creation, but in part because there's a database that it's attached to, and it can attach to web APIs. And so it just makes this really, really simple environment to create mobile applications, web applications, and so on. But the thing that's really cool that we've really been working on is this continuum between pro developers and low-code developers, so that we can have a really great experience for pro developers to create those web APIs that can be consumed by people authoring with Power Apps. And you can still run them through the same CI systems, do quality checks, everything that you would want to do as a professional developer.
Yeah, we've got Power Apps on our backlog to have somebody on and give us a rundown. So we'll hopefully get somebody on and cover that topic at some point in the near future.
Great.
But I think we've taken up plenty of your time. Wanted to be sure to say thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. We're about 3 weeks out from releasing the episode, so we'll do our editing for that and include show notes and all that in the post for that. But be looking for that. We will be back on Monday for the podcast at 6 p.m. Eastern. We will be back next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern for live coding and such. So with that, we will say goodnight, everyone. We will raid our friend over at, I believe it is Jail Code. So with that, say goodnight, everybody, and thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye.